What if I told you one of the most mocked ancient legends, a story dismissed for centuries as fantasy battle fan fiction, turned out to have real bones buried beneath it? You have heard of the Amazons, warrior women from Greek mythology, a tribe of fierce female fighters who rode horses, wielded weapons, and terrified men in legends. For centuries, historians shrugged and called it storytelling, testosterone, and artistic imagination. But what if the myth everyone rolled their eyes at was hiding something no one expected? Buckle in, because by the end of this story, you will question how much of history is truth and how much was ignored because it did not fit the narrative. Let us start where the disbelief began. The Greeks told endless stories about these women. They were said to live without men, raise warriors from birth, and sometimes only meet outsiders to reproduce. According to myth, they fought in the Trojan War, battled. Hercules clashed with Theseus and terrified every hero who crossed them. Even the name Amazon sounded mythic. People later tried to explain it. Some said it came from the Greek for without breast, because of a rumor they cut one off to shoot arrows better. Others said they lived on the edge of the world, beyond civilization. So for thousands of years, scholars said something like this: cool legend, but obviously fake. Women in ancient times were not soldiers. They stayed home. Right. Now here comes the first crack in the old certainty. In the 19th century, archaeologists began digging in the lands north of Greece around the Black Sea region, modern Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan. They were focused on ancient nomadic cultures like the Scythians. Nobody at the time was looking for Amazons. They were looking for warriors and weapons and royal tombs. What they found started to make historians uncomfortable: graves filled with arrows, axes, spears, and horseback gear. But here is the twist: the skeletons were not all male. Some were female, and not just a few. A pattern began to appear. By the late 20th century, archaeologists had excavated more than 100 graves of Scythian and Sarmatian women buried with weapons. Nearly 1 out of every 3 female graves in some areas contained combat gear. Some of them showed injuries consistent with battle-sprained wrists, broken ribs, arrow wounds healed and unhealed. These were not ceremonial placements. These women were fighting and dying with weapons in hand. This was not fiction, but the shift in academic thinking took time. Many historians resisted. The myth of the Amazon was so tied to fantasy that admitting real historical fighters existed meant rewriting what we thought about the ancient world. Now let us set the stage visually. Picture the steppe: plains, open, windy landscapes where horses are life and tribes move constantly. The Greeks traded and fought with these people. They saw them on horseback, wielding bows far more effectively than most. Greek men, Scythian society was different compared to Greece. Women rode, hunted, and fought. Greek writers like Herodotus actually mentioned warrior women in that area, but people assumed he exaggerated or blended travel gossip with myth. But he wrote about a group called the Sauromates, said to be born from Scythian men and Amazon women. The Greeks probably took that real group and turned it into legend over time. And here comes the twist everyone missed for centuries. Imagine the typical historian of the past, usually a man sitting in a library reading Greek texts. He sees stories of warrior women and laughs. He calls them metaphors or cautionary tales. But those same stories were likely based on encounters with real tribes where women did fight. What the Greeks could not process, they turned into myth, and over time, myth swallowed the truth. Entire generations of scholars dismissed it because they trusted literature over archaeology. The true tipping point came with modern science. In the past, archaeologists guessed gender by grave goods. If a person was buried with weapons, they assumed it was a man. But that assumption aged about as well as lead paint. Now researchers use DNA testing and osteology, studying bones to determine sex accurately, and the results were stunning. Female skeletons with arrowheads lodged in their ribs, women buried with daggers, swords, shields, and quivers, some positioned with horses, as if ready to ride into battle. The old idea that ancient women were never warriors cracked like pottery in an earthquake. Here is where the story builds to something even more unbelievable. In 2019, researchers in Western Russia published findings about 4 female warriors buried together. Their ages ranged from about 13 to 40, and they were buried in riding gear and armed. One had an iron arrowhead lodged in her knee, another had a headdress with a ceremonial shield. Beside them were the remains of horses. This was not symbolic. These were respected fighters, honored in death. The researchers called them real-life Amazons, not as fantasy goddesses, but as historical war women who lived and died with weapons at their side. Now picture this dramatic flip. For centuries, the Amazon myth was mocked, ignored, or treated like erotic fan fiction drawn by male poets. But once the physical evidence emerged, the puzzle pieces clicked. These tribes were horse archers, living in harsh territories. Women had to fight sometimes to survive. They rode with the men, hunted alongside them, and defended their people. They trained from childhood. Archaeology did not just confirm a rumor, it exposed a historical blind spot. The myth that everyone thought was imaginary was pointing to a real culture the Greeks misunderstood. Here is a detail that adds spice to the story. Ancient Greek pottery sometimes showed Amazons wearing pants, riding horses, and using recurved bows. Scholars once said artists were using imagination, but then archaeologists found Scythian women, remains buried with trousers, horse bones, and composite bows. The match between art and evidence was almost one-to-one. The Greeks were not inventing costumes, they were drawing what they saw. But there is another twist, a more modern one. The resistance to accepting this truth lasted centuries, not because evidence was lacking, but because of bias. Historians assumed men had always dominated warfare. They assumed stories of powerful women were fantasy. That assumption shaped textbooks, movies, and museum plaques. The myth survived as myth not because it was fake, but because the truth was inconvenient. The Amazons did not live exactly as legend described. They did not build a female-only empire, but the core idea, women warriors on horseback, was real. Are we saying Wonder Woman was historically accurate? No, but the DNA, the burial evidence, and the ancient texts now fit together in a way that makes the old laughter look foolish. The Amazons were real, but they were not a separate species or a magical tribe. They were Scythian and Sarmatian women, warriors living among men in nomadic societies, where strength mattered more than gender. The Greek poets turned admiration and fear into legend. They mixed truth with ego and spun tales that entertained generations. Yet buried under those tales was a factual core. This revelation hits with a bigger message. Myths do not always spring from madness or exaggeration. Sometimes they are distorted memories of real people and real events compressed into story form. The Amazons proved that the line between myth and memory is thinner than we think. What the Greeks could not categorize, they fictionalized. What historians could not imagine, they dismissed. And the soil quietly held its rebuttal for thousands of years. Imagine watching someone brush dust off a skull and realizing the pelvis shape and DNA confirm it was a woman. Then imagine looking beside her and seeing a quiver full of arrows and a bronze dagger. That is reality, not legend. The ground quietly said everything writers ignored. Now let us end with the twist that flips the whole myth on its head. For years the story was told like this. Once upon a time there were warrior women, but they never existed. They were fantasies made up by poets. But the truth is the opposite. Once upon a time there were warrior women, and poets turned them into fantasies because they did not know how to explain them. The myth was real and the fiction was the dismissal. So the next time someone says ancient myths are just stories, remember the Amazons people buried the evidence and mocked the legend. But the legend had bones, and archaeologists dug them up and placed them in front of the world. The past was louder than the doubt. If you want more ancient truths that were laughed at until the dirt proved everyone wrong, hit subscribe now and drop a comment. Tell me what other myth you think might be hiding a secret. Because trust me, this is not the only one.